Hello and welcome to part 5 of our guided tour of the Boilermaker codebase. Today we're going to talk about Redux setup and Redux testing and boilerplate related to our front end. So yeah, let's take a look at the client folder.
Great. Okay.
Okay, so what have we got here? There is a socket folder or socket file, which is going to be the client side version of what we saw earlier in the server video where we were setting up a socket connection. Each client is also going to connect to the server, and there are going to be a bunch of different sockets for every client. History is interesting. That actually is part of our Redux. That's part of our React router setup. So we're going to see that in the next video. Store, we're definitely going to check that out today. And we should probably take a look at index.js, even though I think it's going to be more React than it is Redux. Same with routes and components.
Right, yeah. So even though you told me client folder, I can check the Webpack config to
that's
see
a good point, yeah.
exactly where it begins. So client index.js, that is the entry point for everything to be compiled. So I can just go straight in there. So I can split client index.js. I know that's exactly where it's beginning.
Awesome. So we could see here that there is some React stuff. There's React, React DOM, React Redux, React Router DOM, history store and app. Since we're talking about Redux right now, the provider from React Redux is definitely going to be important. We could see that we're rendering into the DOM when we talk about React later. Our top level component actually is a provider that passes in the store from Redux. Can you talk to us a little bit about what like a provider is or how that slots into the React ecosystem? Are you familiar with that?
Sure. Well, it acts sort of as a global variable, right? And so the store is always available so that you can have anything that you need available at any time. And by using Redux, we can limit ourselves to only using the things that we really need, using things like map state to props, and we can include only the things that we want to change. We're restricted very tightly by Redux into what we can do. And those sorts of actions get dispatched by our match dispatch to props. And we'll see those later.
Yeah, so I like the fact that you kind of made a metaphor here where it's like a global variable. This uses something in React called the context API, which is easy to abuse because usually you don't want too many global variables. But you're right, the React Redux connect function is going to give us a disciplined way of accessing just the parts we need. So we've got our provider and we link it up with our store, and that becomes the outer shell of our entire React app. The store comes in the store folder, so maybe we should check that out next.
Sure.
Okay, we have, as is often the case, an index file, and then a particular domain-specific file, this user and user spec. So let's take a look at what's going on in the index. We have several tools from Redux. Create store is going to be, every Redux app is going to have to use create store at some point to initialize our Redux store, which is where all of our app-wide stateful data will live. Stateful data being data that changes over time. Combine reducers is a way to split up the logic of the state updates into a bunch of individual reducer functions and then fuse those together with combine reducers. So to create a tree of reduction logic. And then apply middleware. Redux can be enhanced with kind of, just like Express can be enhanced with middleware route handling functions that like can understand a request and a response in the next. Redux has its own concept of middleware, which has nothing to do with HTTP, but it's like every time an action is dispatched, maybe we want to intercept that action, do some special side effect, and then possibly pass the action down the chain, or possibly not. Like say, like, no, this action doesn't go to Redux, it causes something else to happen. What else we got? We got Redux Logger as an example of such a middleware. So we had Morgan for Express, which logs in the terminal. We're going to have Redux Logger in Chrome, which is going to log actions that are posted to Redux. Thunk middleware is going to let us do side effects, stuff that's not state update logic, but go make network calls or talk to local storage or something like that. And then compose with DevTools from Redux DevTools extension. This is kind of a foolproof way of integrating with the Redux DevTools extension in Chrome or something like that. The user reducer we end up using. So those are all of our dependencies that we're pulling in, which is honestly half the file. But in the interest of a point that you brought up earlier that I really liked is let's look at like top level. What are the highest level things that are going on in this folder or this file?
Right. Yeah. So as you said, we have our reducer that's being defined, and it says combined reducer, but there's only one thing here. And the idea behind Boilermaker is that this is a starting point. You're going to be adding any sort of models and that sort of thing. So for any model you have, you'll want to add a reducer, and the reducers would come in here. And then this middleware, I don't know that you'd be changing this, but you'll definitely be adding thunks along the way. And then you have the store that's being created, and it's being exported, and that's really all that's happening, like you said, in terms of top level things.
Yeah, so the store, when we create it on that line store equals create store, it takes a primary reducer, which handles all of the state updating logic, but it can also accept some middlewares or store enhancers, which we've currently given it to, the thunks and the logger. Okay, so let's take a look, I guess, next at our user, which is an example of, there's going to be some real interesting Redux stuff there that is actually very typical to the sort of things that students would write into their projects using Boilermaker. Really high level, I like that we have these huge multi-line comments for like a line at a time of code. Mm-hmm. But it's nice. It shows the organization. We've got some constant strings, which are action types. So we can't accidentally mistype the variable, because if we do, we'll get a reference error. Whereas if you mistype a string, the program will never tell you that you've mistyped a string. The initial state, which currently is an empty object. Some synchronous action creator functions. So then we never accidentally create an object that has the wrong properties or something. We always get back a correctly formatted object with .type and then whatever else that object needs. Some thunks, thunked action creators. It's hard to figure out the terminology for some of this stuff. These are going to be things that we do dispatch to Redux, but they don't end up in the reducer. They get intercepted by the thunk middleware and invoked, which means that we could do all sorts of side effects in them. We can talk to our backend. We can check stuff in local storage. We can log stuff out. We can do who knows what. That's not about state updating logic.
And in this case, what's happening here is the thunk middleware passes in the dispatch as a parameter. And then we do this asynchronous call that gets information about the current user. And then that's dispatched to the store. That's right. My understanding. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, this is the idea we talked in a previous video. Why did we have this like auth me route? It was so that every time the client loads this page, the client has amnesia. The browser doesn't remember that it was logged in before. So the program we have on the front end, we're going to see where this happens, is going to invoke this thunk, and it's going to look up who's currently logged in. It's going to ask the server, like, who am I, essentially, and get information about the currently logged in user. There's a kind of more general point that I want to talk about here briefly. I'm sure you're familiar, or you've heard the term dependency injection before. So this is an example. Thunks in general, with the thunk middleware, are a small example of dependency injection. You pointed out that this function receives dispatch as an argument. This is actually passed in by the thunk middleware, which means we don't have to actually pull in a store that we can call dispatch on manually ourselves into this file. That's great, because that means this file could be used with other Redux stores. Like maybe we have Redux on the back end and on the front end, and we do server-side rendering, or we do other clever tricks like that. By making the function able to accept a dispatch, we don't tie it to any particular dispatch, and that can be a powerful abstraction tool.
Absolutely.
What else we got? So we have this auth function, which is another thunk. We'll come back to that, and logout, which is a thunk. They sound pretty self-explanatory, but we'll see the implementation details. Anything else in here? Oh, the reducer.
And the main difference between, say, a thunk and a normal action creator is that it takes dispatch as a parameter, right? Like
well, it's a nested function, too. Yeah. That's really important.
Yeah, so the action creators are just the action You know, like, oh, I take a user and then I produce an action in Redux. And these are, I have a function that takes dispatch, and then using that dispatch, I can create an action.
Right. So the me function, if we look at it here, it's a function that does not return an action object. It returns another function. And that nested function, when it is invoked, which might happen later, that actually causes all this HTTP to run. That's why these things are called thunks, is that they, the etymology of thunk is a little weird and complicated. It has to do with compilers. But
Think, thank, thunk, right?
Exactly. But the idea is that you don't have to do this networking, this action. If you invoke this action creator, it doesn't actually make the network call yet. It gives you a function that could make the network call. So if you invoke it one more time, now you've actually caused something to happen. And this is really good for testing purposes, because often when we're testing, we don't actually want to cause an effect. So if we invoke our action creator, we don't have to take the extra step of invoking like the return function.
So our thunk middleware can provide a testing dispatch that only updates the store and doesn't make any HTTP requests. Or like
That's another really good reason for dependency injection in this case. Cool. So we've got, let's take a quick look at the implementation of those two other thunks. There was auth and logout.
Well, we haven't really gone over the reducer yet. I don't know if you want to go over that before we get there.
Yeah, I think actually that's a good point. Let's do it because that'll actually make it easier to understand what the thunks are doing. So we've got this reducer function, and we know a reducer, it always takes two things and fuses them into one thing. So it takes A and B, and it gives you back a new, B or something like that. Or in this case, A and B, and it gives you a new A. So Redux reducers specifically take a state and an action, and they give back a new state. And the idea of reduction is you keep fusing actions into the state, and it keeps giving you an updated version of the state. So our default state we saw was an empty object, and those action objects have types. So we can switch based on the type. And if it's a get user, we say, okay, the new state should be this user. And if it is a remove user action, well, the new state should be the old default state, which is an empty state. And if it's any other action, then don't worry about it. Just return whatever state we had already.
Yeah, and this switch statement actually, I don't know that everybody would necessarily be familiar with it, because you don't see this in JavaScript that often. Like, this is maybe the one place that I see it fairly often. It's more common in lower level languages like C++ and C, but for instance in Python there is no switch statement. So you might not know that, but this has been around for a long time and has some fun behaviors. But as long as you keep it like this, where every single thing returns, and you don't have to worry about it.
Yeah, so I think you're alluding to like fall through.
Yes.
Yeah, I wish that JavaScript had a smaller and simpler syntax for just easily going to like a mutually exclusive case.
Right.
A case expression, essentially.
Yeah.
That's the way we're using switch here, where we're saying if it matches one of these, return immediately. Some languages have a much tighter, cleaner, shorter syntax for that, but not JavaScript. Cool. So that's a good point. The syntax, it's easy to forget since we don't use it, like you said, all that often. But that's the beauty of a boilerplate like this, is you can just copy paste this and then edit it and hack it, and you look it up in NPM and things
Exactly.
like that.
Yeah.
So we know that this reducer, if we get a user, it sets the state to that user. If we remove a user, it goes back to the old empty state. And by default, it just does nothing. It returns what's already there. That return nothing, by the way, is a really important React optimization. React just uses like triple equality to test if the state's changed. And if it has changed, it will re-render. So by returning the existing state, we're saying there's been no update, and React shouldn't re-render any of the stuff that relies on that.
Gotcha. Yeah, because one other thing I was thinking about this is these are all kind of different types of things. Like, presumably this is a user object, and maybe this will also be a user object, but state I wouldn't expect to be a user object, except that here that's how it's defined. Yeah,
we've given a really extremely simple version of Redux state here that I personally I'm not entirely comfortable with. I kind of rant about this every now and then to different cohorts about like representing not only like the data, which in this case is a user, But metadata, like is the user loaded? Are they loading asynchronously? Did they fail with an error? Did we not ask for a user yet? I think that kind of information also belongs in Redux separately from the data itself, so alongside the data. But making the state look like that, it does make the tree look more complicated. And this is definitely a much simpler, more primitive first pass approach, which you can upgrade and improve on top of.
Right, yeah. And sometimes I think it makes sense to start small and then get more complicated as you go along.
Yeah. Boilermaker, I think this is a good theme of Boilermaker. It's like, it's complicated enough already. We can start with this and then move from there. Cool. So let's go back. We're looking at logout here. And then there's going to be one more, which is auth. The logout thunk just says to the server, hey, please log me out. If that's successful, we do the remove user action, which, as we saw, wipes out the user in the Redux state. And then we do this history push. So history was the last thing that we didn't really look at because it's more React, and we're going to take a closer look in the next video. But in short, this is going to navigate our React app to a different page.
And also, I noticed that history actually has not been passed into this function. So this must be using the whatever is defined in the environment when this is called.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So this particular Redux file is tied to a specific history, and we couldn't reuse it for other files as easily. We talked about dependency injection. There's actually a way to pass in extra dependencies like history into the thunks alongside dispatch, and it's using Redux's with extra argument API. That's getting into pretty advanced use cases, and I think the idea of start simple and we can go from there applies to that. Finally got this auth one. So we pass in three things, an email string, a password string, and a method string. The method being something like login or sign up. And then that returns a thunk. In our thunk, we attempt to log in or sign up by hitting the appropriate route with these credentials. If that works, we'll move on to the next try catch. The next try catch says, oh, they successfully authenticated, either login or sign up. So let's dispatch that action to Redux. The state will update as we saw in the reducer. The user will get set on the state. And then we will navigate to home. Now, there's an interesting thing here, which is we have two separate try catches. The first try catch is specifically for the authentication, the communicating with the backend. If that fails, we'll let Redux know. We'll say, oh, there was a problem, and we'll change our user state to be an object with an error property. And there's a, ow, hit my elbow. There's a return statement there that's really important, which means the next try catch won't even be attempted. So if this fails, that's it. But if it succeeds, we do another try catch, which is we attempt to update Redux. If that fails, then because this is an async function, we really do have to try catch it. If you are inside of an async function, you always need to be able to catch your errors. Unlike normal synchronous code, it will not bubble up to the top of the call stack and crash your program. It'll give you an unhandled promise rejection warning otherwise.
And another thing, I know that a lot of the code that we have in Boilermaker, there's like one try-catch block inside a function or something like that. And you might be tempted to say, oh, just put everything in a try-catch block. And that's okay. But the reason that there are two here is because we have two distinct things which can fail. Not merely one thing that can fail in multiple ways. So whenever you have two distinct things which can fail, that's when you want multiple try-catch blocks. And ideally, you handle the multiple ways one thing can fail in the catch.
Definitely. We've also flattened out the control structure here. The second try-catch is on the same indentation level as the first, but we needed some data from the previous try-catch. So we had to use a let variable, which is a little bit of a trick when you need access to something that was in like an inner scope earlier on. You raise it to the higher level scope, make it mutable. The alternative for this would have been to nest the try-catches. So inside of the first try-catch, we would have put the second try-catch. That gets a little complicated looking. Which is more evil, the nesting of try-catch or the mutable let? Who's to say?
Well, I think there are many people out there who would say that this is better than nested.
I think it's more readable.
Yeah, flat is better than nested, I heard once.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's all of our Redux. Have we missed anything?
Hey, well, there are some tests I can see.
Oh, really good point. Yeah, I mentioned explicitly we were talking about tests, and then I almost skipped it. So let's take a look. By the way, something that Boilermaker does that I really like is the way the testing is set up. All of the spec files are next to the things they test. They're not in a separate test folder. And that's really good because for any given module, you can tell at a glance if there is a test file. And if you're working on that module, it is as easy as it possibly can be to find the appropriate test and to remember to add more specs.
Exactly.
So we've run this, what did we just run? NPM test?
Here, I'll just show you. Yeah, I just ran npm test again, and then from here it runs all the tests.
Oh, and you piped it into Less, which is a pagination program, so you
Yeah.
can scroll through it.
I mean, pagers are amazing, and I
Yeah.
really they come up so often that I wish we talked about them more, but people figure them out.
Sure.
Less is my favorite. There's also more,
but less is more.
Yeah, that's what I heard.
Less is more than more.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I believe that these
Great.
thunk creators are probably what's going to be in this file. Oh yeah, because there it says thunk creators. Boom.
Yeah, there's a couple interesting things going on in this test. We can see that even just from the imports, our dependencies. We've got Axios mock adapter and Redux mock store. So we're actually going to create fake versions of a Redux store. That fake Redux store will behave just like a Redux store, except it'll also have additional methods on it that are good for testing. Things like, what are all the actions that were dispatched to me? What's the most recent state? Or what is the list of all states I ever had? So it makes it easier to inspect the store and understand what happened to it.
Mm-hmm.
The Axios mock is slightly different. That's going to let us make a fake backend. So there's a distinction between unit testing and integration testing. Do you want to talk about that a little?
Sure. So unit tests are almost always no network connections. They are like, I have an add function, and I want to test a particular instance of the add function. I want to test that 2 plus 3 is 5, and that add to 3 gives me 5. And whenever you want to turn something which normally does have a network connection into a unit test, you can create these, like you said, mock backends, so that whenever you submit some sort of request, like normally you would say, oh, I'm going to submit a GET request for something. That mock, what it can do is it knows the type of thing that request would like to receive, and it can just give you that instead of going through the whole request.
Exactly. So the pros and cons of unit versus integration tests are that by removing all of the connections to the other parts of your app, you can know that what you are only testing is that one particular part of your app. We're just going to test Redux alone. The disadvantage, of course, is you could have your Redux code behaves the way you expect, and your React code could behave the way you expect, and your route code could behave the way you expect, but maybe the way they talk to each other is broken. So a good testing philosophy is to have some unit tests and some integration tests. We're just going to show you some unit tests today with Redux.
I think one, before we get away from integration tests, one really, really good integration test is run the server. Is it running? That's, I feel like, the first unit test. Like, is it running? And later on we'll say, is it deployed? Like, is the deployed version what we want at this point? Like, it might not be finished, but is it broken?
Yeah, just the simple sniff test or sanity check of does my code crash is a really important thing, and it's a really easy win usually. It's literally just like run the process and then quit it and see if it's fine.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's take a look at how we've done this. We are creating a mock store, we should call mock store, using this function that we got from the Redux mock store testing library. We are going to check out our thunk creators and see if they do what we expect. Specifically, before every spec, down that before each.
Well, before we get there, I want to point out that we're using the same thunk middleware here. This isn't like a different testing thunk middleware. This is the same.
Right.
And because we wrote our thunks so that they accept any kind of dispatch, thunk will give it the correct dispatch here based on our mock store.
Yeah, totally. We're trying to, if we replace everything by fakes, then we're not testing anything. Okay. So we want to just remove the bare minimum amount where this becomes a unit test as opposed to an integration test.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we've got a before each that says we're going to customize Axios. We're going to make it not the real Axios, but a fake Axios. And we're going to get a new blank store from scratch from our store testing library. After every spec, we're going to wipe the slate clean with respect to both of those fakes. So these fakes have methods that let us like start from scratch every time and clear every time. And we test the me thunk. And the way we do this is we tell our fake version of Axios, if somebody submits a GET request, don't actually make a network call. Instead, pretend you got a 200 status back with this object, this fake user object we've defined. Now we do our store dispatch with the me thunk. Because the thunk middleware has been hooked up to the store, it's going to do our normal thunk action, which uses Axios, tries to make a network request. Our fake Axios intercepts it, gives back a success with a fake user. And we check out in our store, see, hey, did we get the actions we expected? Were the things in the actions what we wanted them to be? Is everything is all the plumbing wired up the way we expected?
Right. Yeah, and we're using the kind of the chaining version of our assertion libraries. I know that there are other ways of doing this by saying like assert something, like maybe you say assert equal, and then you have two parameters.
Lights went off. Keep talking, I'll turn them back on.
All right. Yeah, and here we're doing what I've heard called the method bridge to nowhere, where we have our value and then to be equal get user, and these some people don't like this style, some people do like this style. It's at least readable to us, though, right? Like it's similar to English in a way.
Yeah, the downside of these kinds of assertion libraries is that you need to learn this whole new API surface, all whatever the method chainers are, and they vary slightly from framework to framework. So I always have to remember, is Mocha to equal, or is it like Jasmine has id.to-be, and I never remember which one is which. But that's what docs are for.
Right, yeah. And I think that the Chai, which is the assertion library, supports both types of syntax, where you start off with a method like assert deep equal and then compare two items, and also this one where you have expect.
Yep. Chai has a number of different APIs. I like this API. The thing I don't like about Chai in general is that the creator of Chai, TJ Holowaychuk, who is also responsible for creating Express and Mocha and a lot of other things, he occasionally likes to do really clever things. And with Chai, it was this kind of getter chain where some of the methods don't end in a function invocation. They would say like to be dot true, and it wouldn't be invoked. And then linters complain because they're like, that just looks like an expression to me. That looks like a value, but you're not doing anything with it. You're not storing it in a variable, or you're not causing a side effect. And they don't realize that, in fact, it's using getter methods to do side effects behind the scenes.
Right.
So I had issues with that. He improved it slightly by making it, if you did one that was an invalid property, it would automatically throw an error. So that's a little bit better, because before then it was easy to accidentally misspell and say like to be TUR or something.
TRU.
Yeah. And you wouldn't realize. You'd think that it was passing, but it was passing for the wrong reasons.
Yeah, spelling errors are the second most subtle error that I've run into that's cost me hours of time. Yeah. The first one is difference in capitalization.
Which is kind of a special case of spelling error, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so that's the me thunk. We've also got a logout thunk. It's going to look very similar. This time we're telling our fake Axios, when somebody makes a request to auth logout, send a 204 success. No content success. We do our logout thunk, and it should result in certain actions being sent to the store. I believe, we can test this, I believe that if we didn't configure our fake Axios with the proper route handling, and one of these things attempted to post or get or put to a route that we hadn't configured on our fake Axios would actually throw an error and say like, that's not a route. So this is actually also implicitly testing that our thunk doesn't make other network calls that we didn't expect. Let's try it out.
So I'm just going to change that T to an X.
Logu.
and I'll run the test script again. Now I know that you can specify a single test to run, but the whole test suite is easier to run. So.
Sure. And it looks like we did get some kind of error status. So maybe
I gotta go to the end and then go back to the beginning, I think. Yeah, there we go.
So we go down there, and we do have, it looked like it failed. It was red, although we can't see that here.
Yeah, it's funny because you can see some colors, but not all of them. So I'm not sure what the deal is
that's
there.
true. I don't know how color codes, ANSI color codes get like bubbled up through various wrapper scripts. But it says can't read type of undefined. Interesting. So we do get an error, but it's not a very helpful error.
Yeah.
It's the kind of error that it's like you wish that they had just built in like a nice error message, but they didn't.
Like, for instance, you would expect something like auth logout is not defined
or recognized,
route.
Fake route or something like that.
You don't see that string of text anywhere here.
Yeah.
Although you do get user.js 4625, which this is close to that.
Offset by whatever, like Mocha causes some wrapper or something.
Well, let's see. Yeah, I think, I don't know. I'm not sure exactly where it's pointing to there. But for me, whenever I'm debugging something, especially when I get a traceback, I try to look, what is the thing that's most local to where I'm working? So I made a change to user.spec.js, and it's clear that that's where I should look. So I shouldn't be looking like, it says type error, and if I just read the bottom, well, I guess this is all client store user.spec.js, but sometimes you'll get multiple files, and it'll be like a file like maybe client index.js, and it's like, well, I wasn't even working there, but the code is eventually called there, and so sometimes your errors will say, oh, it's in client index.js, but then it's just the JSX for like the provider or something, and you're like, that's not very helpful.
Sure.
So if you think of local first and say, okay, where was I just working? Well, that's probably where the error was, and let me revert that to a place where I know it works, compare the diff, and see what changed.
And this is a really strong argument in general for writing your code in small iterative chunks and testing constantly as you go.
Yes.
Whether you've done a formal spec-driven test or just like a manual acceptance test, you usually want to avoid writing like 7 modules before you even try any of it out.
Absolutely. Yeah, I like to tell people, commit after every change that adds anything. If it adds functionality, commit. If you remove functionality, commit. Make every commit be a place where something is working, and then work to add something specific. And then whenever you're done adding that and it works, commit again.
Absolutely. Something that I'm actually disheartened by now that I've had time to digest and think about this error message, it said it was can't read type of undefined in line 46. That's where it's checking action 0.type in that expectation.
Oh, yeah.
So in fact, the mock Axios doesn't throw an error even if it tries to get a route that doesn't exist.
Yeah.
Which I kind of wish it would. Maybe in the docs there's a way to configure it to do something like that. But the way it's set up here, it won't be very helpful in that regard.
Yeah, so store.getActions is returning a list of where the first index is undefined. And so then you try to do undefined.type, and then that's where the error came from. And that's,
Okay, so that's our logout thunk. And is that the rest of our Redux test?
Yeah, I believe so.
Okay, I think that wraps up all the Redux essentially, except for where it's connected to React in our components. We're going to come back to that in the next video, which is all about our React components and how they integrate with Redux. So, see you then.